Sean Stone. Stick around for an exciting episode of Buzzsaw. Some of you may recall that there was an infamous allegation in 1985 of child molestation at the Presidio Army base outside San Francisco. The ringleader of this molestation group was Michael Aquino, lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, but also the head of what was called a Temple of Set that he had founded. Set being the ancient Egyptian god that some would call Satan. So today, joining us is a man who was working very closely with Michael Aquino. He was a Department of Defense librarian and researcher, and he had much access to Mr. Aquino throughout this time period, and for almost a decade, in fact, working inside some very classified realms of the U.S. Army and intelligence. So joining me today is Douglas Dietrich. Douglas, we want to start with this episode with the Presidio because you were working there, obviously. You had a lot of insight and access as an eyewitness. What was going on? You know, what did you see, and what do you know about the abuse of children and what was happening and why?
Well, it's important to put all of this in perspective in terms of that whole gray, murky underworld of the United States Army daycare during the 1980s. And I'm still getting a lot of feedback on my voice, so hopefully you're hearing me clearly. And I'll just continue going ahead as best as I'm able with the distraction of the feedback. But other than that, I'll plow ahead. If
yeah, you're coming clear.
That's wonderful.
We can hear you clear. So
okay,
we got you.
Wonderful, wonderful. So what happened was the United States Army in the 1980s had, of course, bases all over the world, far more so than it does today. It had bases in, for instance, places like Okinawa, Panama, South Korea, the Philippines, West Germany. Many of these bases are closed today. And at that period in time in the 1980s, the United States Army was caring for over 100,000 children a day. And the allegations that were ongoing at the Presidio military base were ongoing throughout all of the military bases, Army, Air Force, Navy, worldwide. And special investigative teams were called in to try and figure out whether these allegations were true or whether these were childhood fantasies, and invariably they would rule against the children. So one of the reasons that they would have as rationalization, most specifically in the state of California, was that the children were deemed not to be of a mature enough age for their statements to be taken seriously in an adult court. This is what made child abuse the perfect crime. That meant that anyone could do whatever they wanted to these children, and whatever the children said would be dismissed because whatever they said, they were too young to prove as adults. They wouldn't be taken as any kind of serious evidence. Well, there was what's going on at the Presidio specifically, and at West Point and a number of other bases, was children were displaying injuries, anally, vaginally, throughout their bodies, and these children were being brought before military MDs. Many of them were children of military MDs. And the real stink occurred when officers' children were being assaulted. Now, what was going on was essentially what later on became known as the Officers' Massacre. And what happened was many of the officers who were considered to be of a Christian demeanor or a demeanor that was not conducive to honoring the new religion of Satanism in the U.S. Army had their children being assaulted, and as a result, many of them refused their promotions, and not only would they refuse advancement, many of them would refuse to serve, and they would one way or another serve until their commissions were over and not renew their commissions. So what happened was an enormous amount of officers, because of the way their children were treated and the way that no justice was ever brought forth for their children, a lot of these officers ultimately left the U.S. military. And what happened was many of the officers who filled their place were followers of the Temple of Set. So our military became gradually more and more administered by Satanists. To put this into perspective for you, the Chaplain's Handbook, which people can look up online, was written by Colonel Michael Aquino in retirement. When he retired as a full-bird colonel, then what happened was they contracted him to write the Chaplain's Handbook for all of the chaplains of any faith in the U.S. Army. And the reason that they did that was so that all the Catholics, the Protestants, the Buddhists, the Scientologists, whoever else was serving in the Army of any faith that had chaplaincy, all of the other chaplains had to bow to the rituals of the Satanic Church. So they didn't hire a rabbi, they didn't hire a priest, they didn't hire a deacon. They made certain that the Chaplain's Handbook was written by a Satanist, so that when magical rituals were being conducted, everyone else would get out of the way. Now, one of the reasons that this became so possible was through the work of human battering rams of Colonel Michael Aquino, such as Colonel Timothy Chalmers, and there was, of course, James Cheney of the 1st Earth Battalion. And the 1st Earth Battalion actually established a Satanic warrior monks monastery in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And this was paid for by your tax dollars, but it privately incorporated so that it could be severed from the U.S. Army chain of command. Now, the reason that this is so important is because Colonel Michael Aquino would often, as you well know, appear on Oprah Winfrey, many other television talk shows, dressed openly in his satanic regalia. And he was allowed to proselytize for his religion so long as he did not wear a U.S. Army uniform. Now, because he was not allowed to wear a U.S. Army uniform while he was proselytizing the religion on mass media, he circumvented that through James Cheney. James Cheney was able to wear his full military uniform and promote the 1st Earth Battalion, which began to become more and more responsible for military training. One of their followers was Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Chalmers, and Chalmers wound up teaching at the United States Military School of Advanced Military Studies in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The acronym for the School of Advanced Military Studies is SAMS. Now, he was responsible for training that class of officers known as the quote-unquote Jedi Knights, who led the United States Army in Operation Desert Storm. Now, to put this into perspective for you again about how important Colonel Aquino's influence was, he was very similar to Henry Kissinger in terms of his State Department influence through several administrations, to the point where Henry Kissinger was, in a very real sense, running America's foreign policy as opposed to our domestically elected presidents for a period of time. Aquino had that kind of effect on the U.S. military. One of the ways that this was done was in the dismissal of the concept of satanic crime. Now, in the 1980s, thanks to men like Geraldo Rivera, we have a very negative view of investigations of satanic crime. Now, whether that was intentional or not, I do not know. But what I can tell you is that every major urban police constabulary had begun to specialize or isolate specialist departments that would do nothing but pursue and investigate satanic crime, because satanic crime was beginning to become a major national concern. Now, an example of this would be the lady who arrested my high school teacher, Gary Willard Hambright, and her name was Inspector Sandy Gallant. Last name spelled Gallant, first name spelled Sandi. Now, Sandy Gallant was a San Francisco Police Department inspector who became notorious when a headless body was found in Golden Gate Park, and in place of its human head was placed the head of a black chicken. Now, she said, this is Santeria, and it is Valjean Houdoons of the most negative sort, and someone will try to break into the coroner's office and reunite the head with the body in order to ambulate a zombie. Now, everyone laughed at her, and she almost lost her job until a security guard who worked at the San Francisco coroner's office lost his life fighting off an assailant who broke into the coroner's mortuary and basically tried to reunite the head with the body. Now, he escaped, whoever this individual was, with the head, but the body was not reunited, and the potential for a zombie being created, rampaging through the city of San Francisco, apparently never took place. Sandy Gallant at that point became recognized nationally as a specialist in satanic crime. Now, at that point, Sandy Gallant was confronted with myself, who told her that my high school teacher, Gary Willard Hambright, who was an ordained Southern Baptist minister without a pulpit, who was homeless, he lived in a church, who could not keep his child pornography stashed at the church, so he kept it at John O'Connell Vocational Institute, the high school which I attended. I majored in commercial illustration because I grew up in San Francisco before computers became an everyday and universally accessible tool. In those days, we had an entire underground industry of drug-oriented comics, occult-oriented comic books, pornographic comics. So as a commercial illustrator who won a scholarship to the San Francisco Academy of Art, and this was before they lost their accreditation for a number of years, I was illustrating pornography before I was of legal age to purchase it. Now, my high school teacher, Gary Willard Hambright, kept all his child porn stashed in the art lab, saying that it was art references. Now, all the teachers at the school would peruse it for their own gratification, but ultimately that's how I got him arrested. Now, keep in mind that not only was he teaching at the high school, where he was of no harm to someone like myself because I was too old for him, he ran the daycare center at Presidio Military Base. Now, the child daycare center at the Presidio Military Base had the potential for caring for 1,000 children, 500 children. Now, to put this into perspective for you, the Presidio Military Base was 1,500 acres. It was an enormous part of San Francisco, almost a quarter of the San Francisco city and county. Now, the Presidio Military Base was the Western Defense Command Center. It was responsible for the administration of the 17 western states and for the occupied Kingdom of Hawaii, now a U.S. state. Now, this Presidio Military Base had an enormous amount of underground tunnels dug by the Ohlone tribe of American Indians who had been enslaved by the conquistadors. So the Presidio Military Base had buildings such as the Presidio Officers Club that were 200 years old, and as old as many of the buildings on the East Coast. Now, these tunnels were later reinforced and made into battery tunnels for massive artillery to shell any invading ships. Now, after World War II, they became lead-lined and concretized to house Nike Zeus missile system that could retreat back under the tunnels. And these were anti-ballistic missiles intended to take out any incoming ICBMs. That's how important the Presidio military base was. Now, when the daycare center became a national scandal, they ordered me to destroy all of the maps of those tunnels. Now, no one that I know of has any extant maps of those tunnels. Now, to put all this into perspective again, when Gary Willard Hambright was finally indicted for his crimes, he was indicted for no less than 14 assaults against children who were all under 4 years of age. Now, this was by a federal grand jury that would have indicted him for many hundreds of more such crimes had he not died of AIDS. So it was calculated that he had infected no less than 500,000 children with AIDS. Now, that is a monumental crime against humanity, which the United States Army covered up. Now, one of the men who was accused of molesting the children was Colonel Michael Aquino. Now, ironically, while he could not walk around on Oprah Winfrey or Geraldo Rivera wearing a military uniform, he walked around Presidio military base in full pancake makeup with a widow's peak, clipped eyebrows, and a 666 tattooed to his forehead in full uniform because he was the officially recognized satanic chaplain of the U.S. Army. Now, I, in a sense, am responsible for his getting freed or getting relieved of a lot of the charges against him, because as his officially appointed liaison, a job which I held under orders, I must emphasize, this was not something I volunteered for. I had to present to the FBI and the CID, the Criminal Investigations Division of the U.S. Army, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, San Francisco Police Department, the fact that he was not on base during the time of the major childhood molestations. Now, in all fairness, all of the children who were showing signs of anal, vaginal injury, etc., these children were taken in automobiles by either the FBI, the San Francisco Police Department, other investigative agencies, and they were driven past Colonel Aquino's home right next to mine. He lives only a few blocks away from me. He's practically a next-door neighbor, and he and I have lived in the same neighborhood for decades. Now, they were driven right past his home, and all of these children were able to identify it. And they all claimed that they had been taken in that home to what was known as the Black Room, entirely painted black, where he himself and Gary Willard Hambright were both dressed in woman's clothing, and Colonel Aquino's wife Lilith was dressed in man's clothing, and they were forced to perform unspeakable and heinous acts on each other and on themselves, and were, of course, molested and raped. Now, this was described at length and ad nauseum, not only in the Presidio military base, but also at West Point. Now, what happened at West Point was a young lady was brought in, probably around the year 1984, if I remember correctly. And this young lady had all of the normal injuries that abused children have. We're talking about anal rape, vaginal rape, and she basically was one of the first people. This was 1984. She was 3 years old. She was one of the first people to bring attention to the fact that the West Point Child Daycare Center, where all these children were forced to attend, was building number 666. And 22 months just months before her case, there was a 22-month-old girl who had been murdered by a U.S. Army Staff Sergeant on West Point, and he was allowed to go scot-free. He was never punished. He never spent a day in jail. And all kinds of other children, many of them the sons of pediatricians, the daughters of military MDs, started complaining about being forced to eat feces, drink urine, rub all of these materials all over themselves. Well, guess who investigated all that and said that they were all literally full of it? Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani was in charge of the investigation. He said all these children just want attention. It's all childhood fantasies. Now, at that same time, a special investigative division was investigating all kinds of these crimes that were going on in Panama. Many other things were going on at many other military bases all over the world. And the end result was, thanks to men like Rudy Giuliani, all of this was dismissed. And the end result was, of course, men like Aquino walked free. One of the reasons why was because, again, professionally, I had to acknowledge the fact that, as far as I knew, being his liaison, he had never physically been on the base during the time of all the molestations. Right. Now, during that period of time, around 1986, 1987, he was basically doing a lot of work in Washington, D.C. And that, of course, is where West Point is at. So he was at the National Defense University, the George Washington University. He was getting his master's in public administration. Now, what's so interesting is, of course, in 1983, before that period of time, the Virginia County Police were asked to make an inquiry into the leaders of the Temple of Set. And they came up with some surprising facts. Aquino, of course, was an expert in the techniques of psychological warfare, a skill that was to prove useful to him in more ways than one. And what happened was, it was unveiled, and with what I already knew became public knowledge. He held a high-level international security clearance. He was on secondment to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and he was a member of the World Affairs Council. Now, what happened was the Virginian inquiry uncovered the fact that 12 other leading lights in the Temple of Set were U.S. Army intelligence officers. So he had a following that came to dominate U.S. military intelligence. Now, how this was viewed domestically was when Lieutenant Colonel at the time, James Channon of the 1st Earth Battalion, began to be used as a liaison and a consultant in occult crime, of all things, to police departments and federal investigative organizations all over the United States. The FBI, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the in Los Angeles Police Department, the Seattle Police Department. Now, everywhere that Colonel James Channon went, he told everybody, hey, you know all this satanic crime that Sandy Gallant and other people like her are investigating? You know, if you're a member of a religion, say you're a Roman Catholic, say some Roman Catholic bank robber robs a church, robs a bank, and he drops, when he leaves the scene of the crime, a Roman Catholic saint's medal. Does that implicate the Catholic Church? And they would all say, no, of course not. Then he would say, well, how about if you find a serial killer, you track him down to his home, and his apartment has got victims' heads, body parts all over the place, but he's also got a fetish for the Madonna Negra, the Black Madonna of the Polish Catholic community. Does that mean that the Polish Catholics are responsible for harboring a serial killer and producing one? And of course he said, no, of course not. So then he said, you have to do the same with the satanic religion. So at that point in time, FBI, all these federal agencies, the local police were ecstatic. They said, oh great, that cuts our job down at least 25%. We can cut off all these investigations where we find a headless body in the middle of a pentagram. We can cut off investigating anything where we find black candles burning at the site of a crime. where a dog has been run over multiple times. We no longer need to consider these satanic. So the end result was pages and pages of satanic crimes investigation techniques that had been incorporated through the professional work of investigators like Sandy Gollin were removed from investigative field manuals of federal departments and from local constabularies. And as a result, the wave of satanic crime came to an end. And that's why whenever they find a body now, headless in the middle of a pentagram, it never makes the news because they don't report it, meaning the police. They will dismiss it and say, oh, that's freedom of religion, and just because whoever did this follows that religion does not condemn that religion of Satanism.